Yeah. Okay, so start again. xwélmexw il squeak deletes a skwah casta alets cheats a letzel homachrium homach equala. Greetings, everyone. My name is Dylan Robinson, and I am joining you today from the lands of my downriver relatives. These lands that have always been stewarded by Musqueam, Squamish, tsleil folks, those lands that are now called Vancouver. Although we refer to them, Stalo folks refer to them as alets. And that is because alets translates roughly to wide at bottom. This is where the river opens up and is wider. So this is how we understand our relationship to this point in the river. And so for those of you as well that may travel here, you might think, oh, that is the word that can be used for Vancouver. And it can only be used for Vancouver if you're Stalo. So there are many other words to refer to this place, and this is where I'm greeting you from today. And just to give you a sense of where I come from, this is, as you can see here, Vancouver or Alets, at the University of British Columbia in particular, marked there where I work. And our lands are located in this area demarcated by the white border. So this is Soltamach, or Stalo lands. And the reason that we identify 26 different nations we identify as Stalo is because all of our communities are located along the river, which we call Stalo. So that's just a bit of geography for those of you who might not be familiar with this part of the world. Okay, I'll just pause there. So I'm going to focus today on resurgence, Indigenous resurgence, and particularly I want to start from an understanding of what resurgence, Indigenous resurgence, feels like. And with that, I will just begin reading. Since the first uses of the term Indigenous resurgence in the early 2000s in the work of Leanne Simpson, Jeff Corntassel, and Tayegi Alfred, Indigenous scholars have offered numerous pathways towards its definition as community-specific forms of Indigenous thought and creative practice. Such work is itself a further extension of Native literary nationalism, Native American literary nationalism, for example, in the work of Robert Warrior and Robert Womack. Much of this work has centralized our relationships as Indigenous peoples to our lands and waterways, from which our languages, governance models, epistemologies, and ontologies flow. At the same time, the question of the affective and sensory relationship to the material flow of Indigenous resurgence has been less often considered. Resurgence theory has thus largely focused on the events of water governance and Indigenous sovereignty, rather than focusing on the structures of feeling, the feeling with water that give rise to our core values as Stalo people and our teachings. Moreover, given the importance that scholars like Jeff Corntassel have placed on the everyday acts of resurgence, it's important to ask how resurgence occurs through the everyday experience Indigenous folks have, not just with our lands, but with our waterways. How, we might ask, does resurgence flow? How are we immersed in it? How does resurgence feel, and how is its politics, as itself an everyday redistribution of sense, made buoyant as it surges through its currents and eddies? My presentation today asks what I, as a Stalo writer with specific relationships to specific waterways, might learn about resurgence through a consideration of sensory and affective relationships with water and water-based public artworks by Indigenous artists. I here ask how my words, that is, the sound and musicality of Halkomelem language that Stalo folks speak, how these words center the liquid materiality of water and our relationships to its surging and resurging movements, how it centers these as starting points from which to theorize a sensory politics or what I've called a sensate sovereignty of Indigenous resurgence. Sovereignty is here not theorized as an explicit program of capital P politics, but as the feeling of what Glenn Coulthard calls grounded normativity. Given resurgence's literal meaning, as when a stream re-emerges after being submerged by development, this essay's focus on Indigenous sensory knowledge seeks to daylight some previously submerged streams of resurgent listening. I ask what constitutes affect's ebb and flow in resurgent listening. To deepen our understanding of the feel of Indigenous resurgence, I argue, means understanding resurgence not merely from the ways it emerges from Indigenous narrative, knowledge, or content, what we might call resurgence's events, but instead from its material foundational structures. How, I want to ask, do Indigenous artworks bring into being reparative feeling futures, rather than merely narrating representations of the future? How might the structures of Indigenous artwork allow us to feel futurity through their structures rather than through their content, for example, their stories, narratives, and depictions? To provide a provisional answer, I want to turn to a particular artwork, and that artwork is a piece by Rebecca Belmore called Wave Sound, located in Mi'kmaq lands in the area now called Grossmore National Park. So you can see the work very small there in the distance. Situated atop a cliff in Grossmore National Park in Mi'kmaq territory now known as Newfoundland, this is on the east coast of Canada, Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore's public artwork, Wave Sound, directs a large, conical listening device toward the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. Through its title, the work's promise is that visitors might be able to hear better the waves' sound. The form calls us to listen. Visually, it promises a tool, an enormous earpiece, by which to hear an oral equivalent to the visual sublime of the lookout, the fjords and vistas and cliffsides that punctuate the scenic coastline. Here, Belmore's earpiece sits in relationship with the form of the tower viewer. These telescopes and binoculars permanently mounted on a metal stock are common along this route, as they are at many tourist vistas, although I do think this is a bit now, I've seen more and more removal of these from, at least in my part of the world, from tourist sites. The primary purpose and pleasure of the tower viewer is to extend the capacity for a visual surveying of the land. While the lookout provides the opportunity for a panopticon scan and capture through photography, the tower viewer extends visual acuity and collapses distance. Both visual technologies of the lookout and the tower viewer bring us closer to the possession of place through the feeling of surveillance and surveillance. I contextualize Belmore's Wave Sound in relation to these familiar visual technologies, not just because they're located in close proximity to the work, but because they have a relationship to the promise of vista tourism and access to the sublime. This promise of visual access circulates around and alongside Rebecca Belmore's piece, Wave Sound. Yet, her work also frustrates this desire. Unlike the tower viewer, always situated perfectly at human eye level, to use Belmore's work, visitors must awkwardly position their ear beside an opening, rough with the shape of an ear outlined on it, roughly 1.5 feet above the ground. The work thus requires listeners to negotiate how they will place their body upon the land. Depending on the listener's height, this involves variations in crouching, sitting, resting, and kneeling. Perhaps it requires leaning in and contorting one's body. Whatever bodily improvisation the listener engages in, Wave Sound emphasizes that the body must have some other connection to the land. By doing so, what wave sound here demands is that the listener considers their bodily contact and connection with land as a form of listening. Indeed, the same connective relationship to land is mimed in the very design of the artwork. Constructed from a cast of rock formations at the site, wave sound is a material echo of the land that uses the land and its formations as a tool through which we might hear. The imprint of the land itself becomes the structure through which we listen. This background adds even more significance of what we might be able to hear through the piece. If the size of the listening device was not enough of a promise that we can better hear the land and the waves, surely listening through the land or the imprint of the land holds even greater promise of an authentic connection to this place. It is within this context of promises and hopes that I walked up the hill at Greenpoint to listen myself. Crouching upon the ground, I placed my ear up against cold metal, matching my ear against the metal ear of the sculpture. When I did so, what I heard was astonishing. I heard almost nothing. I did not hear the wind, the earth, the waves, nor any other non-human relation of that place. I did not hear the human sounds of two women, even walking up right behind me, approaching me to see why I had contorted my body to place my ear against this unidentifiable form. "What do you hear?" one of them asked me. Instead of answering, I moved aside to offer them the space to listen. And after listening for about half a minute or so, I asked her then the same question, "What do you hear?" Her response was that she wasn't sure she heard anything, maybe just a bit of wind. As a xwélmexw visitor and guest to Mi'kmaq territory, I listen with minimal knowledge like that of many Canadians or tourists of Mi'kmaq history, of Mi'kmaq people whose lands I'm listening to. The same statement could not be made about a settler or many other Indigenous folks being offered the opportunity to listen, or the same could be said of folks given the opportunity to listen to Stallo, the river where I live, from xwélmexw and Skwah, the lands where I'm from. Indigenous folks often know as little as settlers do about the Indigenous lands and about other Indigenous lands and their histories. We are all products of a settler colonial education system that has not taught us anything about Indigenous histories and lands in the plural. That is, Indigenous histories at a distance. I think it's quite different. And I noticed this now through my own daughter's education, that there is quite a difference between what is taught about Musqueam, Squamish, and tsleil people in history here, but that is really limited to this precise place, rather than thinking about the many Indigenous nations across the lands that we now call Canada, let alone the globe. So what does it mean to listen as a visitor and guest? What can I hear as a listener and a guest at wave sound? How might I bring my experience of Stallo, the river where I'm from, into relationship with Mi'kmaq waters? While it may be true that the day I visited wave sound happened to be a quiet day, without dramatic sounds we might expect from such a rugged coastal landscape, waves crashing, wind howling, gulls screeching, I'm also inclined to say that Belmore's work is not intended to function as merely an oral equivalent to the spyglass and tower viewer at other cliffside vistas. It was not designed to bring those sounds closer to us as the oral equivalent of a tower viewer. In navigating the frustrated promise of hearing literal wave sounds by this earpiece made from the land directed towards the waters, I feel most keenly my body as I find a posture and position to place and rest my body alongside the land. In this orientation, an orientation of feeling through the body as listening, I'm opened up to listening as an international relation with the non-human. Wave sound demands more of the listener. It asks that the listener contend with a prefigurative consumption of a sublime landscape and promise of the oral vista. It asks, moreover, for a much smaller act of resurgence, feeling the land against our body, a listening resurgence not of the ear at all. For Indigenous listeners like myself who find ourselves standing upon, living on, and questioning our relationship to the lands stewarded by other Indigenous people, what might we then hear by listening through Mi'kmaq land toward the water? To what extent does this work allow the feelings of resurgence to be felt through listening? When we think of the thing called international relations, as I just mentioned briefly, some of you might think is a bit of a strange phrase in this context, we probably think of capital P politics, diplomats representing nation states and high-stakes trade agreements. But I'd like to suggest a much different kind of international relations here, prompted by Belmore's wave sound. These international relations are neither the relations between nation states nor between human individuals. They are not national at all in the sense of Western state-oriented entities. Instead, I'm reorienting this term to describe the relations between two dissimilar communities of life. The national in this sense is the same national described by Anishinaabe writer Leanne Simpson in her chapter Nishnabeg International in her book As We've Always Done. In this chapter she writes, "One doesn't have to physically travel to be engaged with internationalism. We have many nations that are coexisting within a given landmass already, whether those nations are made up of relationships of human or non-human beings. My nation is not just composed of Nishnabeg. It's a series of radiating relationships with plant nations, animal nations, insects, bodies of water, air, soil, and spiritual beings in addition to the Indigenous nations with whom we share parts of our territory." More specifically, Simpson writes about the relationship between the Anishinaabeg and the Hoof Nation, a relationship that was not maintained in their history, as Simpson describes, and needed to be reaffirmed through treaty after the Hoof Nation left in protest from being neglected and treated disrespectfully by the Nishnabeg. In her story, Simpson describes how reestablishing this relationship with the Hoof Nation required that the Nishnabeg, quote, specifically, quote, the diplomats, spiritual people, and mediators went to the Hoof Nation to just listen. They listened to all the stories and teachings the Hoof clan had to share. They spent several long days of listening, end quote. What Belmore offers us in wave sound, I suggest, is not the content of wave sounds, nor of any other sound that may be captured via the ear as part of soundscape tourism. Instead, what Belmore offers is a much quieter version of what I would call reparative internationalism. I demand that we place our bodies on the land in order to sense relations anew. To feel international relations through the body, hands upon the rock, the soil, and grass, in a position from which we might conduct international relations affectively and sensorially. The negotiations that might take place through listening as a bodily relation with the lands one is a visitor upon, and upends the Western orientation toward instrumentalizing international relations toward trade and economic stability. In the international relation of listening through the body, what we are presented with is an opportunity to feel a moment of fullness, and also a much smaller moment of relation, a quiet listening haptics. Wave sound here denies the desire for oral surveillance by instead providing a structure through which we are simply asked to establish the most foundational relationship. Through its structure, wave sound does not represent Indigenous futurity through a story, but calls us instead to resurgent listening through affective and sensory-oriented internationalism. So I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit more about where this work has led in my own relationship to our land, Saltamach. For all the importance of finding models and forms that allow us to listen internationally as a connective relational practice between Indigenous people Such listening holds equal importance for listening at home. This is particularly the case for members of Coast Salish communities and nations to recenter non-divisive forms of relation in the face of a history that has sought and continues to seek to divide us. And just to give a little bit of a background here, I'm going to be talking about the ways in which our nations here in Vancouver, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and also Stalo nations have found ourselves pitted against each other as part of court cases where we have to demonstrate a singular sort of property-based model of sovereignty to land rather than the co-stewarding model that we've always had. So just to give a bit of a heads up of where I'm going. Within this framework, I ask, as a member of the Skwah First Nation, one of many communities located upriver from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, how do I listen along my ancestors' relation to this place called xwélmexw? How shall I listen to this place I have a connection with that is now partitioned by borders and fences? How shall I listen against property? Against this value that separates our communities through a definition of sovereignty in the singular, construing it as ownership, and denying our models of interfamily and intercommunity politics. Historically, the model of singular boundary-marked sovereignty has pitted our communities against each other, requiring us to enter Western courts to disambiguate who amongst us has the most legitimate rights to reclaim land. Our own land, as absurd as that is. This system, amongst other systems for defining fishing rights and resource-related rights, requires our communities to enter into adversarial relations against each other to demonstrate who has the deepest hereditary connections to the sites under dispute. We are asked to mobilize our ancestors as the first, a displaced form of settlement alongside a practice of naming singular origins that feels precariously related to other settler colonial structures, including the singularity of discovery. Stalo and Squamish writer Lee Maracle details this history in a short story called Goodbye, Sanok, about a court case that decided the Squamish Nation's sovereignty of an area in Vancouver called Sanok. Some images here. This is Lee Maracle, and this is a painting of the Sanok area. In Maracle's story, she recounts exactly these feelings of disconnection from Sanok's history that she is intimately tied to as a descendant of Katsalano who was forced to leave the site along with other families. As Maracle and other historians detail, families living at Sanok were told with little warning to take with them only 3 duffel bags of belongings, as families were then ushered onto barges where their homes were set afire behind them. Maracle details not only the history of this forced relocation, but our current context of disenfranchisement, of the courts that decided that Squamish people alone, rather than Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and even Stalo people, should be allowed to continue a model of co-stewardship. This history not only had the effect of eroding our intercommunity relations, but has had what I believe is a more detrimental effect of disconnecting us from feeling shared relations to the lands we have always stewarded, including a disconnection with our non-human relations. The primary importance of Maracle's story isn't, however, detailing the history of forced relocation or the environmental impacts of settler occupation, or as a site of industry. Instead, I believe Maracle's story equally works to reconnect readers, and particular Coast Salish Indigenous people, with Sanok's, with a connection to this place and our non-human relations in this place. She leads us through her goodbye to Sanok, not from a Western orientation of singular farewell, but as a transformation of a relationship to place that allows for feeling connections anew. Given my previous analysis of Belmore's wave sound as a listening device that prompts a reconnection between land and body, I want to end today with a poetic response to Miracle of my own that offers a device for listening to the land and water at Sanok. While my poetic response does not use the same material or form as Belmore, it's concerned with the impression of land upon material, that is, the material of my words. My response works with the bounty of sensory description Miracle offers in her short story, and seeks to immerse it within an imagistic poetics and auditive temporality. Playing with the gaps in translation between our values as Coast Salish people and how the English language delimits sensory experience, this poetic work occupies a space for naming connective affect. Here, as in Belmore's work, affect, including sensory knowledge and the way we feel this knowledge, is not merely a central part of theorizing Indigenous resurgence. It is central in constituting resurgent practice and experience. Our futures as Indigenous people rely on the potential of resurgent affect that not only centers relationships to land and kin, but moves us toward reconnecting with that which we have become dissociated from. Affect itself, like the specificity of Indigenous knowledge and protocol, surges and moves like the bodies of water we are stewards of. It surges through our voices and how we listen to our language's connection to land. To focalize our writing through affect allows our writing sensate sovereignty. It allows eddies, rises and falls, surges in ways that are particular to our individual experiences of water kinship. So I'm going to read this poem for you now. And the work is called, this is another image of Sanok, taken in 1907. So, this is my work, Sanok, Sanok, Sanok. xwélmexw, and everything begins with song. Sound, sparks of fire, and xwélmexw. The warmth of cedar around you, and Skwah. Wind whispers, and Ecologies tells. Xoxelhmetset, and slow, then slow, with low songs, even the happy ones sad. In a common garden, slahal singing, slahal shouting, slahal teasing, and titelum quas iwalums. Slahal is a game that we play, a stick gambling game. There's lots of fun. We really laugh at everything. So that is the end of that poem. And just as a brief conclusion, while I identify as Stalo, this affiliation does not point toward a singular First Nation, but instead a larger group of 26 different communities. The word Stalo, as I've already mentioned, means river. In particular, the body of water that holds the misappellation Fraser River, after Simon Fraser, one of the first explorers of this area. Identifying a Stalo is a way to point toward an intercommunity affiliation between nations located along the water. I've heard folks say many times that everything we do as Stalo is linked in one way or another to the river, from directionality to our language, to the importance of the river in providing for our people as connecting our families. The way we understand the world is always in relation to the river. I'm also a member of the Skwah First Nation, one of 26 nations who identify as Stalo. Skwah is the modern pronunciation of the word Skwah, a word that literally means place to go through. So named because our people could canoe through Hope Slough, or Slough, depending on how you say that word, Slough, if I'm spelling it out in English. That people could canoe through Hope Slough in quieter water than the main Fraser River, but still in parallel with the Fraser. A slough is a space that exists alongside the edges of a river, and often where the old channel of the river once flowed. A slough, in my experience, is a place and process where we might slow the pace for contemplation. If the drive to Indigenous resurgence could be characterized at times as an urgency to return to those values and structures which are irreducibly ours, then the flow of this demand has perhaps swept us along together in its strong current, without the ability to take the time to deviate from its singular course, to question the time in terms of how we feel the flow of resurgence, and what other flows might lead us to different and perhaps divergent practices for materializing specific Indigenous structures and values held by our communities. If I experience Belmore's wave sound as offering a process for me to engage in resurgent squalowel that is thought and feeling, it's not because the work carries me along the steady stream of listening toward the sound of waves. It's instead because I experience the work through the divergence of the slough and alongside intercorporeal listening. In a different way, my response to Miracle's story, Goodbye Snock, is a slow reading, or a slough, that runs parallel to Miracle's work, alongside it. In both my experience of Belmore's work and my response to Miracle, there is a slowing, a sloughing, a space running alongside the river's current, where I might observe resurgence at a different pace. I am offered a space of pause where I do not need to place all my focus on navigating the current. Thank you.